Oh, wow. Hi, Mike. All right. We're right at 2 o'clock today. Welcome everyone to our sixth xAPI cohort learning cohort web session. This marks the middle of our fall semester. I can't believe that time has gone by so quickly. But welcome everyone. We are really excited that you're here. We're really excited for our discussion today. Today we're going to talk about sending better data using xAPI profiles and offer some additional tips for improving your statements. Today we have Jason and Aaron here to present, and we'll do a more formal introduction when we get to their section. We have 836 people registered for the fall 2020 cohort. That's 10 more than last week. So now is a good time to say that just because we're at the midpoint and 6 weeks in doesn't mean that anybody's late, and you might have some folks joining your teams that are going to be interested in participating. So please welcome and help onboard and use and produce what you can with your project. Also, we'll be talking about our team check-ins. We'll do our second team check-ins today. So if you are a presenter for your team, I see Matt Cleaver just put in the chat, thank you, Matt, that you're presenting for your team. This is going to help our producers be able to give you mic rights when we get to that section of our web session today. So go ahead and put if you're presenting on behalf of a team in the chat right now. Behind the mics today, we have myself. I'm Jess Jackson. I am the xAPI cohort host, and we also have Megan Torrance, yay, who will be hopping in and out, having conversations. And she is our Chief Energy Officer at Torrance Learning, and also a pretty well-known evangelist for xAPI, and been talking and have a lot of knowledge about xAPI for a long time here. We also have Aaron and Jamie behind the scenes who are helping things to run smoothly. So if you're experiencing any tech glitches or anything that you need support on, feel free to use the chat and ask Jamie and Aaron. So thank you, team, for being here and helping things run smoothly. Today, as we said, is our sixth session, so we're right in that midpoint, that mid-section of cohort. Today, we're going to be talking about sending better data and using xAPI profiles and other tips around improving your statements. We'll move into talking about the role of the LXP with xAPI and the learning ecosystem next week, and we'll also have our first case study. So we're moving into seeing what it does, how you do it, into actual case examples are the next section of cohort. So that's really, really exciting. So you can see how things are working with different industry level and enterprise level examples. With that, I'm going to tee up and pass over Jason Haag with Veracity and Aaron Silvers with Making Better.
Thank you, Jessica, Megan, and the whole team at Torrance Learning for the great introduction again and inviting us to talk about xAPI data and sending better data and using profiles. I'm going to talk a little bit about profiles and best practices as it stands today. And then I'll hand it over to Aaron. He'll be talking about ADL's new profile server they've been working on and some other exciting resources coming here in the near future. Aaron and I are both big xAPI profile evangelists. We've both been involved with xAPI since its inception. While we were at ADL, we were also both key contributors to the profile specification itself. So please reach out to us on Slack. Aaron and I are both on there. I think we're both participating in the assessments group. You should be able to look up and search and find us. Let us know if we can help answer any questions you have about profiles or improving your statements in general. Okay, a little bit about my company. So I'm one of 3 partners at Veracity. We're all alumni of ADL Initiative. We played a big role in SCORM and xAPI where we were there, and we still continue to support those standards today. We're trying to help move the xAPI spec through the process to become an official IEEE standard. We provide general technical consulting services, but we're also experts in xAPI. That's kind of our key focus. We helped build the ADL conformance test suite while we were there at ADL, and more recently we built an LRS product called Veracity Learning which has a free version available at lrs.io in case anyone's interested in checking that out. Making Better is a learning technology consulting firm with expertise in design thinking, research and development, and implementation consulting. Aaron and Megan are experts in xAPI. They develop profile spec, and he'll be talking to us later about the profile server. Aaron, did you want to add anything else about Making Better?
No, man, you just advertised me way better than I do, so go right.
Gotcha, great. All right, well, I'll hand it over to you for this first part. I think you're going to kick off this beginning.
Well, sure. So it's really important that we're all kind of grounded as to why we even want to send better data. Like, again, we're good point, Megan Torrance, that it is Megan Bow, not Megan Torrance, that when Jason talks about Aaron and Megan, he's talking about, yeah. Thank you. Anyway, back to topic. The reason why we're sending better data is because one of the challenges that we have is like, it's one thing to be like, okay, we can only do so many things with SCORM, but now we have xAPI, we can send all of this data. Well, that's great, but we have challenges when we kind of do things kind of on our own with data, all right? And one of the biggest challenges that I've seen, really, I'm going to borrow from Lean and Six Sigma language because this is like the language of business in IT, and they can relate to what we're talking about here, okay? So downtime is a concept. It's an acronym that is usually applied with Lean, all right, in terms of eliminating defects and eliminating waste, right? And when we are dealing with processing data, we are usually prone to a lot of wastes. These are the things that we can help affect with a better one, just overall a data strategy, and preferably an xAPI profile, and we'll get to that. So when we talk about defects, we're talking about the mistakes that require additional time and resources and money to fix. When we talk about overproduction, this goes to the idea of like how many people are tracking, how many folks track like everything under the sun that they can think of with the idea of, oh yeah, we'll figure out what to do with that data later. But meanwhile, they have huge challenges. One, making sure that they are actually correctly storing all the data that's actually being generated. Two, validating that all that data is there. And three, actually using it. And then anytime they need to deal with space issues, processing issues, bandwidth issues, all this overproduction of data starts to become a problem at scale. All right. And that's the biggest challenge with all of these, is that these are all problems that do not scale well. So the more data you add, the worse these problems get exponentially. Okay. So that's the reason why we're going after doing stuff like this. Jason, you want to take it from here?
Yep, sure will. For those of you that like definitions, here's the official one from ADL. Now, if we're going to start talking about profiles, profile is a human or machine readable documentation of concepts, extensions, statement templates when implementing xAPI in a particular context. And what do we mean when we say human readable or machine readable? A good analogy here is like the credit card. If you ever look at a credit card, it's got the human readable information on the front, your name, your expiration date, so forth. On the back, there's a magnetic strip, or nowadays there's a microchip in there. It's additional machine understandable information that only the card can process. That's what profiles also enable. There's a machine readable side and a human readable side, and I'll get into some examples of those in a minute. But in a nutshell, as Aaron pointed out, it's really about data strategy. A profile is the blueprint for a successful xAPI implementation. Helps you send better data for many reasons. Helps you come up with common vocabulary, descriptive metadata. Helps you figure out like what are the requirements, what are the things that you should capture and be reported on. Okay. So let's first let's talk about some of the things you can do to send better data, send better xAPI data. When starting your project, one of the first steps is to define the requirements for what you want to track. So you can leverage existing vocabulary from profiles that have already been established, rather than reinventing a wheel. There's a lot of resources out there. But I want to talk about some general best practices around to help you send better data and resources here. So ADL has a vocabulary server. It's been around for a while. It's at xapi.vocab.pub. That is going to be replaced in the near future by the new profile server that Aaron's going to talk about in a little bit. But you can still use this site to find existing concepts. By concepts, I mean the verbs, the activity types, extensions, and you can use those in your statements rather than trying to coin your own. So if you go to the site, you can simply just click browse by verbs. They're in alphabetical order. You kind of got to use the browser to click to search and find things if you're looking for a specific one, because there are a lot there. It's grown quite a bit in the past few years. And one of the downfalls, though, right now is the vocabulary is just like terms. It's just those concepts. It doesn't allow you to see the statement templates or allow you to validate your content against statements or anything like that. That's some of the things you'll be able to do with a new profile server that Aaron's going to talk about later. That's very useful, seeing what those statement templates, what the rules are for those, and how to make your content match those. Another resource that's on the site that I think is still valid and useful is this use case template. This is a good planning resource for you to start thinking about defining the different types of scenarios or things you want to track with xAPI. Some of the other steps on the site may no longer be valid because the profile server is going to help automate publishing things rather than people doing it manually by creating a JSON LD document, which is highly error prone inside of GitHub. So an example of what I was just talking about in defining the use cases, we did this when thinking through the use cases for the video profile several years ago in the video community practice. So you can see some of the typical things you want to define in a use case is the actor, the preconditions, the workflow, post conditions, and some of this should help you start to arrive at the requirements for the statements that you're going to come up with, and then you can start to generate some sample statements from that as well. After the video community of practice created the use cases and requirements for tracking, they then published this human readable version of the profile. I have the URL up available at the top of the screen there. This document has all the statement requirements and vocabulary that should use anytime you're tracking video interactions. This human readable version is useful for developers that need to look up like standardized requirements so they can implement video tracking consistently. But as you can see in this screen capture, there's also learning record provider obligations and intended usage, which is very useful in helping providing more guidance to use when specific verbs and extensions. And these actually translated into the machine readable templates that are used later, what these obligations and usages are. So that's useful for developers. Another cool resource you can use is to look at existing profiles is Torrance Learning's Profile Viewer. I think this tool is helpful because it pulls out all the statement template requirements across the profiles into one place in kind of a nice bulletized summary. In the current human machine readable versions of all the various profiles out there, like the one I just showed you for video, the statement templates are in the documentation, but the human readable format may differ kind of across profiles. They're not very standardized. So this tool from Torrance kind of helps standardize that presentation. Okay, let's see, next slide. And speaking of standardizing the presentation of profiles, I want to mention Aaron and I recently worked on another project together for a customer where we defined a performance support profile. After receiving lots of feedback from the customer, we discovered like one of the most effective ways to present human readable documentation for a profile is provide a list of the bulletized requirements. And as you can see on your left, you've got set actor to whatever the requirement is, set the verb to this. You know, it really goes down the list to every piece of the statement data model that you need to set, followed by a statement example on the right side. This is proving to be really effective, I think, for developers, but also if you think about acquisition and contracting professionals as well, they need to reference requirements in a contract when procuring xAPI products. This could be very helpful. So we're hoping that this work will likely influence the upcoming efforts. There's an IEEE group working on standardizing a human readable version of profile. And I think that'll influence that a little bit. All right, so that is some of the current good practices around xAPI profiles today. I'm going to hand it back over to Aaron. He's going to talk about some recent developments as sending better data with the profile server.
Thanks, Jason. All right. So what Jason just showed you is really how people are dealing with things with best practices towards organizing data strategy and stuff like that today. Like if you were to drop everything right now and get back to you're already at your desk. Who are we kidding? We're all sitting in our homes. But if you were to switch context back to work context and wanted to start throwing into trying to put together a profile, what Jason showed you is exactly all the things you have available to you right now to do it. Okay. What I'm going to show you is what's coming. We've actually already, I think we've delivered all this code already, at least the first version of it to ADL. So within the next couple of months, we expect that ADL is going to be hosting and rolling this stuff out for everybody to use. So what I'm going to walk through now is like the tooling and the processes of how some of this work that Jason's kind of highlighted to you in terms of how you plan around data strategy, how you document that strategy, and how you implement that strategy operationally. We've put together basically like a one-stop tool that will do, authoring and editing of profiles. It will serve the profiles. It will also help with profile validation. Okay. So here we go. So when we are starting to talk, when the concepts of how we deal with profiles, we usually think about it in terms of collections of statements. Like, what is the statement that we need to make? What's a valid statement for this profile? So, for example, it's like if we were creating a profile around, let's say, professional nursing skills, okay? There might be a whole set of competencies that you might identify with that, but there also may be specific training procedures that you'd want. There may be specific patient interactions that you need to model, and that has a specific language associated with that, all right? So a big part of a profile is creating these statement templates, all right? It's basically just a set of instructions for how xAPI statements associated with a profile should be structured, all right? And then it describes, much like in the instructions that Jason showed earlier, all right? In these very specific parts of a statement, you are going to do these X things, all right? And we control that with machine language, as we'll talk about. That's with JSON LD. Now, statement templates are just one thing that a profile can give us and that we can put in there. There's another tool that's available to us, and it's specifically useful. We put it in there specifically for analysis. When we are dealing with xAPI data, you can imagine that, a typical statement might be, let's just say 1K, all right? That's 1 kilobyte for a statement. It's a nominal statement. It's not much of it. It's not a whole lot of giant information there, okay? But imagine that you have 10,000 concurrent users and you are taking a course that has, that lasts maybe 10 minutes. And within those 10 minutes, it's issuing 9 statements. That's a lot of data now coming at a really quick time. And if you're trying to do analysis on that data, the way we would normally do that stuff, or the way we used to do that stuff, at least in, back when we were building our own MySQL databases and stuff, is that we would just basically query everything, or we'd create indexes, right? And then we'd go in and look at all the different data, and then we would select all the things that hit our marks of what we want, and that was what we would report on. And when we're dealing with big data, that kind of work is intensive. So determining properties are almost like, it's like the surface level rules. Is there a data point with this thing in it? Does that even exist? Because if it doesn't, don't even look at the statement. Skip over it, because you're wasting your time. You're not going to get what you need out of this. Right. So we can also identify in profiles determining properties that allow us to filter out statements from our analysis before we even go looking and unpacking that statement to see what's in there. Does that make sense to people? Thumbs up, hands up. Yay, no? Okay.
Aaron, I'm going to actually, sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. Could you go back? So it seems like a determining property would say, hey, this statement is a useful one. And since we're all thinking that we're sending useful statements, can you give an example of a statement that wouldn't have one of these determining properties that we would still want to send?
Well, don't think about it in terms of sending it. It's more on the analysis of it. Okay. If we are so for example, let's say that go back to our nursing skills idea. Okay. If we're identifying a bunch of learning activity and we are looking specifically in one sense for, let's say, session information. Okay. We're going to look for timestamps. We're going to make sure that all of these things, we're going to look for timestamps. We're going to make sure that we have, whether maybe it's a success status, maybe it's a lesson status, whatever it is, right? But those are the things that we're going to look for. And anything that doesn't have those things that we're looking for, we're not even going to look at. We're just going to ignore. Now, that's again, a determining property in terms of like what's going to make for a valid statement in this profile, not necessarily that it's an invalid statement or doesn't have application in another profile.
Awesome. Thank you. I knew that was going to be a question people were going to have. So
no, it's important. Remember, all the things that a profile defines it defines for that profile itself. Now, any profile that may subsume or consume or import that profile, if they're going to make use of those properties and all of their components as they are, then all those rules exist within the greater profile. But we don't ever assume that unless somebody else is bringing in this profile, that those rules apply anywhere else. Does that make sense? These are like application context for implementing xAPI.
That's key. Thank you.
There you go. There's a good tweet. So patterns describe groups of statements with matching statement templates. So this is where we yes, profiles exist right now. There's a spec for it. In fact, there's a standards group that we're starting for this, Matt. So, we can talk about that afterwards. So the patterns describe, document for folks and for the purposes of automation, the combinations of statements that might be important or valuable. Okay. And so for example, here's a really obvious one. A lot of times when we're trying to debug things that are happening with e-learning, we're looking at what happened within an e-learning session, right? And that session with e-learning, when we're dealing with SCORM or old school CMI, that made sense. In xAPI, we leverage timestamps and statements to give us kind of like this kind of reverse engineered idea of a session. Okay. And so we look at initialized to a terminate, and that helps determine, and anything in between is the attempt or the session. And knowing that that's a pattern that we're looking for will allow tools to be able to quickly identify, these are the things that are important. We should index these things in this way. There are a number of concepts that are specifically associated with profiles. And these are the reusable components that once you create a profile and it goes into a profile server, these concepts are available on that server to be reused to create new profiles. Okay. So for example, we can create reusable activities, activity types, attachment usage types, documents, extensions, and verbs. And the idea there is that by creating these things as reusable things and making them findable, when you are looking to start creating your own profile to organize your own learning, data strategies within your own organizations, not that you need to do a profile to do that, but it may be useful just to have everything in one place. I get that, right? These are things then that would be on a profile server that you could then import and reuse, and it would have all the information that you would need in order to help enforce those rules as they are. Now, all of this is to set up automation and to make our lives easier. So let me kind of paint the picture for you of what this is going to mean from a content authoring perspective, because most of us on this call, and I relate to you, we make learning experiences, right? That's fundamentally what we're here. The only reason why I wanted to do xAPI at all was because SCORM sucked, and we couldn't do anything useful with it. I couldn't track anything that anybody ever actually really wanted to know. So we did xAPI. So here's what you're going to get out of it finally. So typically, a project in e-learning authoring tool is considered like one single piece of content. That would be like one project is like one scope, right? Now, most e-learning authoring tools, your storylines, your Captivates, etc., they generally obfuscate any of the access to modify the xAPI features, okay? Now, there's good reasons why they do that, right? There's a whole lot of people who use these tools who don't know anything about xAPI or SCORM for that matter, and allowing them to go futz with things that they could easily break would be a problem. So they're kind of kept away. Now, there are some e-learning authoring tools that do allow for customizing xAPI statements, all right? The Domino One platform is one. Lectora is another one. There's another one out of Israel. Jason, I don't know if you remember the name of it. Lots of good reviews on this authoring tool, but I cannot think of the name right now.
Composica, maybe?
Yes, Composica. That's what it is. So these are tools that allow you to actually go in and edit and what xAPI is going to be produced. But profiles can help authoring tool vendors to tailor the options available to you, all right? Depending on the instructions of a profile. Vendors would be able to show or highlight settings that are required versus what's allowable, all right? Wouldn't that be handy? Just to know what you can do. Hiding settings that are not allowed so that you are completely disabled from doing bad stuff. And warnings to authors when authoring decisions might risk nonconformance to the environments that they're clearly developing for. All right. These are things, low-hanging fruit, that would save us as content authors, and especially content developers, tons of time. So let's take this another level more strategic. Let's talk about microlearning and component level approaches to how xAPI profiles might be of help. So there is an authoring platform. It's all based on open source, basically like CSS, JavaScript, HTML components. And the project is called H5P. I have no idea even what it stands for. They're out of the Netherlands, and they were a Mozilla Foundation funded project to create open source educational resources that could be reusable. So each content type in H5P currently is developed as a standalone activity. And literally every single component they have is hard-coded to generate xAPI statements off the bat. You use H5P, you're making xAPI statements right from jump. But instead of hard-coding all that stuff, these could be governed by an xAPI profile for H5P. And that means that then these can be offered to generate the proper statement after associated concepts with H5P activities. And what that would gain then is, one, it would improve the maintenance. You could abstract the xAPI statement generation from the component. So, one, if they are trying to manage what their data strategy is in terms of unifying things across all of their components, that would be one level that they could control that with. But there's a side advantage to that. And that is, let's say that I want to use these components and I want to use them for this professional skills nursing curriculum that I'm making. What would be great is if I could swap in my profile and my needs so that it would produce the statements that I needed without having to come up with another proxy or another way to jam in the certain little data things that I need for my environment. Okay? This would allow then custom mappings for domain-specific, context-specific data generation for domain and context-specific activities with open source or at least third-party tools, but all making use of the exact same data. So another big reason why we looked at xAPI profiles as like a bit of a panacea is because another complication that comes from hard coding all of this data at the content level or at the level of hard coded into the code is that data models change for any number of reasons. And every single time a data model changes, that requires rework to happen to upgrade and retrofit existing legacy stuff. That becomes a huge chain of work that becomes, somewhat of a recursive loop. So thinking about the reasons why data models change informs not only why you might want a profile, but how you might want to think about putting together a profile, right? The reason why data models change is because there's workflows that need to be accommodated. There are new requirements that need to be controlled for. There is now a need for auditing that wasn't there before. Any of these things could trigger a need to change and revisit how an organization collects and makes sense of and how it assigns value to data. And those are all things that we hopefully can govern through profiles. So considering all that, how do profiles fare? Well, they support different working styles and workflow approaches to data modeling. They enable machine-readable data dictionaries via JSON LD representations. That's all the semantic web stuff that is the gobbledygook that we try to makes our eyeballs roll back when we see it in Monaco font. A proper xAPI profile document that's human readable can serve as a business glossary where it details in human readable language what you got to do. So when we can manage all of that through an xAPI profile server, we can track why changes are made in addition to what changes are being made. We can correlate those changes with development changes. We can implement data model version control, and we can provide an audit trail for compliance or governance. All right, in terms of here's the changes that we're making into our enterprise data collections, and here's why. So, profile server highlights. Let me kind of show you a bit of what you're going to get when this tool finally lands. All right, and I'm going to focus on four things that I think are really key for us all. One is we're clearly creating and managing profiles. Two is finding the right things, and then monitoring xAPI profile server activity just to know what's happening with profiles. And then thinking about the best practices that are being built in by design to help us make and just clear the road to making better decisions faster. So for one thing, let's talk about finding the right things. We did a lot of usability research in the development of this xAPI profile server. All right, I just want to say that again. So for the cheap seats, we did a lot of usability research to validate that our search design allows for prioritizing profile results while also exposing results for other items like templates and patterns and concepts that might also meet the search query. All right, so we didn't expect that we were going to hit this one out of the gate, but we did, or it seems like we did. The solution seemed to be, our solution to search seems to be well received. Our interactions were predictable, so we're happy about that. That, to me, seems like good usability. There's a means to monitor activity around profiles in terms of the context of that profile server. Administrators are going to be able to monitor the most viewed, the most exported xAPI profiles on the server. All users will be able to surmise the level of active viewership in any listed profile. You'll be able to see the touches, whether it's through API access or through the server itself of specific profiles. So you have an understanding, you have some idea of does anybody even use this thing, right? Because that's a huge problem in terms of information relevance, which is if I'm looking at a resource, is it still good? Does anybody know if it exists? So we're trying to help identify the things that are living and real. Many users likely already may be coming to an xAPI profile server with their own profile already drafted with JSON LD, and we want them to start with the progress that they've already made. So we can import and start with documents that you've already started writing with JSON LD. As long as they're properly formatted. Now, sections in a profile that are empty are going to clearly prompt authors what to do and when. So if there are things in a profile that if there are no concepts, for example, you're going to be encouraged to add concepts. If there's a need for, step-by-step in terms of how to create a statement template, that guidance is in there. Concepts that are clearly defined by other profiles are going to be clearly identified. So this lets you know whether this is something that you can change or this is something that you would have to recreate and then in order to change it. Okay. And the difference there is if it's a concept that you own, you can do whatever you want. And if it's a concept that somebody else owns, you either use that concept as it is, or you're basically creating a new concept that's just like it, but a little bit different. By default, authors are going to be encouraged to use the identifiers that they control. We can generate the identifiers with the server, but once that identifier is out there, it's done. It's fixed. You can't change it. And so the idea there is that once you create identifiers, they're permanent. Use the identifiers that you yourself have control over. So I'm going to give you that's basically the highlights. And I'm going to give you a little very quick kind of functional overview of basically what all is in this thing. There are accounts. Server administrators are going to be able to search for members with accounts, and admins can grant admin privileges to other members. And everybody works out of this concept called a working group. All right. At the working group level, all right, that's where profiles are created. Even if you're the only person in a working group, you're going to create your profiles through a working group, and the reason why is because these profiles should be existing beyond the association with any one author. So in order to transition this stuff, we need to make sure that people can actually that the work survives beyond just the one person who created the account. That's why these things have to exist in a working group. So about these working groups, they're very simply, they're the means by which people can collaborate on and transition ownership of xAPI profiles. So any profile server can create a working group. This is just a technical thing. Okay. Now, by default, the user who creates a working group is going to be the administrator of that group. They can add other administrators. There are 3 ways to create a profile on the server. You can manually create a profile using the server interfaces. You can upload a JSON LD document using the server, or you can create or import through the API. In order to get a profile started, you need only 3 things. 1, an IRI, which is an identifier, basically a URL, the looking thing that says this is the identifier, unique identifier for this profile. You need a profile name, and preferably a description. A descriptive description would be best. Concepts, again, are the reusable components of an xAPI profile. So a profile server can manage the versioning of these definitions. It's not just about defining it. It's about also managing the revision of this, right? So activities, activity types, attachment usage types, documents, extensions, and verbs. These are the concepts that can be managed through an xAPI profile server. Now, the statement templates I talked a little bit about earlier before, right? They instruct tools and services on what data is required in each xAPI statement for a particular interaction or event. Statement templates can associate a lot of information to help with selection and implementation, including the name, description, list of translations, tags, etc. You can associate an example statement. You can identify the rules describing the presence of data in specific data object locations for validation. Those are those determining properties I was talking about earlier. You can add scope notes, which would be like the more narrative, directional, instructive information related to a particular concept or a particular part of a profile. You can also list associated concepts. These are concepts that, again, so we talked about earlier, a couple of slides ago, how you can see a concept from another profile and identify that profile is owned by that concept is owned by this other profile, and you can't make changes to it. And I also said that if you wanted to make a slight change, that you'd basically be recreating that concept for your profile and then make your change. But this is the associated concepts part is where you would say, this is the thing that we borrowed from. And you could list that concept there. And that would also then provide assertion information on the back end that would allow machines to make associations of when we see this statement in this context, it's also kind of basically just like this other thing, which may be very useful down the road in terms of doing big picture analysis around any number of things where you are looking to associate like activities or like concepts or like interactions together. All right. And then there's also the statement template references, any part that we're going to reference from a statement template. So that's that. Talked about patterns before. Patterns describe groups of statements matching statement templates. They're ordered in certain ways. Okay. Now, I don't want to get into a whole diatribe around like what patterns are important and how to do patterns, stuff like that. Suffice it to say that we have this concept of primary patterns, which are going to be a combination of statements that have meaning to a profile. All right. And that when something is in the primary pattern, every statement received with that profile ID is going to be checked for conformance to that pattern. But you can have secondary patterns, branching, one-offs, and so whatever, right? And secondary patterns only have statement templates and will not be checked for conformance unless it's pulled into the primary pattern for the profile. So if it's in that level, then it's there. Again, we talked a little bit about search, but when I was talking about the ways in which you can see the usage over the last couple of days, all of this is to give you some sense as to like if the information you're looking at is credible and active and useful. All right. From an administration perspective, administrators are going to be able to manage user accounts, manage working groups and roles, manage profiles, verify profiles, and access analytics. All right. And then we have APIs. Working group administrators can work with API keys, right? They can review existing keys, they can edit them, they can create new keys for people within the working group to access the profile server through the API. And generally that is scoped to work that is within their working group. Jason, I'm going to kick it over to you, and then we can get questions at the end, if that's cool.
Yeah, that's fine. You did have one question in there about can the profile server be upgraded over time with little impact on existing profiles?
I don't know, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it really shouldn't matter, right? Unless the server's down. That would be the only impact.
Yeah, no, the server, the profile server and its operations are really separate from the data that it is managing. Okay, they're not hand in glove that way. They are separated out for a reason so that the data can persist.
And then I think maybe, Aaron, maybe the root of that question is and we're asking you to be a fortune teller. In the future, will this be backwards compatible? I know one question I always get is like, well, how much should I jump on this now? Mm-hmm. At the risk of doing something that later will become obsolete?
Well, I can tell you that nothing's ever certain, right? We are taking xAPI profiles now into standardization. Jason and I are actually like helping run that. And the reason why it's being sent into standardization is because pretty much like it's kind of a no-brainer in terms of what it does and what it will do. Now, there may be more things that can be governed by profiles as a result of the work that IEEE will do in the next year. But I do not think we're going to fundamentally change anything that we are currently doing in the way that we're doing it with the xAPI profiles and xAPI profile server. But again, nothing's ever definite or certain until it's done. But we're not looking at making breaking changes to what's already there.
Sounds good. And I know you've got a few, I think that's all the questions from the chat. I know you've got a few more slides left and a few more minutes, so I won't take any more time.
Yep. I'll take it back over here. So, Aaron spent some time earlier talking about, the whole purpose of profiles is for sending better data. And right now, a lot of people are using authoring tools We've seen a lot of statements over the years, and in areas they could be improved. I took the liberty of trying to time this around the cohort coming out, and I thought it would be useful for this group, but I did publish an article, and I put it in the Slack channel a couple weeks ago. But what I thought are some best practices for xAPI statements, and there's probably more, but these were like some of the most common things and gaps we commonly see. And, it was kind of apparent to me, like, this is not really common knowledge. Like, in many cases, the poor practices are the result of the authoring tools output and people not knowing that the default put is not good, or not knowing that, hey, if you're a savvy developer, you can actually go and tweak the authoring tool output and make the statements better. Megan pointed that out in the chat earlier. Captivate and Storyline even have some JavaScript triggers now. Aaron mentioned several earlier. They do allow you to customize the output, but what changes do you make? What are these practices where you can make your xAPI statements better and ultimately lead to some better analytics? So the article goes into more detail about the benefits, but in a nutshell, these are the top 10 I kind of came up with based on things I see. Number 10, check for typos and duplicates. Often we see statements where people use the wrong IRI for a verb. Aaron just covered. That's one of the things that a profile server is going to help with, is making sure you can't manually mess those things up as a human, because there's going to be a publishing tool to fix that. But, until that tool is in place, you can still do a quick sanity check on your IRIs and like we do a spell check on things we write. Right? Make sure there's no duplicates or typos in there. Number 9, reuse requirements and templates from existing profiles. Right now, the human readable profiles that are out there define the requirements and how statements should represent certain things. There's tons of them out there. Even going back to like tin can recipes, there's standardized ways of doing things you can easily leverage as part of your project rather than reinventing the wheel. That's basically all that one's saying, all that thing's saying. And the benefit of that is that you'll see some immediate gratification in the LRS. Some LRS is already set up to build useful analytics without you having to build custom reports and queries based on how things were created in certain profiles. 8, use context extensions to store additional data about the learning environment. This can lead to help formulating predictive analytics. You could include all kinds of contextual information. For example, you could include information about the department that person is in, competency information, maybe even the browser that they're using, and combine some of that more demographic data with xAPI analytics. Number 7, use result and result extensions to store outcome information. That's typically, we've seen people not use those, unfortunately, and that's what that result bucket was created for. Number 6, strategically identifying these points in a learning experience using verbs to start and end of a session. The CMI5 profile and the SCORM profile do this. That helps you determine when things are started and finished. You can get into some advanced analytics, such as showing when how users progress through different learning paths. There's a particular graph diagram called the Sankey diagram. That's kind of neat. You can show learning path progression if you do something like this and make sure that you have like an initialized and a terminated verb to kind of mark the start and end of the session. Define activities by their type. I've seen some of the authoring tool output, and this is not just a bash on authoring tools. Really, I've seen the other xAPI statements out there not identify the activities, the activity type. That makes it really hard to do queries if you don't know what activity thing you're looking at. Number 4, create unique identifiers for each activity. That's really critical. If you think about it, 2 different activities should not have the same identifier. Otherwise, the learner could accidentally get credit for doing the wrong learning experience. It's a pretty big deal. And it seems trivial, and a lot of people actually use the activity ID. I was guilty of this a while back. I used to get the window href location and append the file name to that and make that the activity ID. Well, if you think about it, that's not a good idea. If that content actually moves to another server or somewhere else, and you dynamically get the location href and a appended file name to it, then you're creating a new unique ID for the same activity. So you should really come up with a good scheme and make sure just all the activities are unique. Maybe keep a log of that. Number 3, represent common assessment interactions. There's a way to do assessments. It's defined in the xAPI spec. Could it be improved? Sure. Are there people working on assessment profiles? Yes. But this is a good standard way to do interactions with assessments currently. It's already in the spec. And you'd be surprised where people try to reinvent the wheel a lot. And there are some good reports and LRSs that already support the way the xAPI spec prescribes to do assessments. Number 2 and number 1 are probably 2 of the most important. Context registration. Make sure you put that into your statements. It makes it possible for reports and analytics to identify that statements should be considered part of a single attempt. If you're looking at attempts tracking and that kind of thing, it's really important. And number 1, parent and grouping activities is really important in creating those relationships, whether it's you're doing a course and you're trying to say a lesson as part of a broader course activity or so forth. There's lots of different groupings you can do. You can do parent and just like generalized groupings, but establishing these relationships provides a way for you to establish the levels of granularity between your content. And that will ultimately result in more robust reporting and analytics, because you can it'll help you with aggregating granular analytics across parent activities, and also can enable exploratory analytics by drilling down or drilling up into related activities. Again, let me flip back to the prior slide if you want the link for that article. But hopefully that's helpful for the cohort participants and kind of ties things up. And I'll stop there and hand it back over to Megan and Jessica and save some time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. What we're going to do is we have about 9 minutes left for today's session. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And then Jason and Aaron, would you mind answering questions in the chat if they haven't come through? Thank you so much for that very detailed presentation and the resources, so many rich resources. I appreciate that. So what I'm going to do now is switch over and share my screen so that we can get into our GitHub team updates. And what I'm going to ask for teams that are presenting their updates today, please keep your share out to around the 30-second mark so that we can end right on time. Team, and I'll start right with Team Down Under, who doesn't have a presenter here. They've updated their application, and they actually have in all of your updates that have been posted are right on our xAPI Cohort website teams. If you go to the GitHub teams, you can see it. So you can read more about their update, but what was really cool that they included is their current state of the application. So you can go there and see that. So this is where I'm located. What they're building is emergency services geolocation tagging using xAPI. They have some updates on what they're doing and other accomplishments and developments. Team ECE also has an update for this week. I saw Joanne is on the call, but I don't know, Joanne, if you can speak right now. One of the biggest pieces of updates from them is a need. So they would like help and support reviewing and getting feedback on some of the posted material. So if you want to go ahead and jump in and look at Team ECE's posted materials in their GitHub page and provide feedback, that would be really helpful for this team. The next team that we have on the list is HR Open Standards and Assessments WG, and I think that was Brian Duck. So Brian, if you're on the line and you want to give an update, you can go ahead now. All right, maybe Brian is not on, or so then the next team that we have is Kaltura, and I know that that's Aaron to give the update for Team Kaltura. So Aaron, if you're able to give your update now.
looking for a team to be involved with. We decided this week that we're actually going to dig into Kaltura's interactive video paths, which essentially allows you to create a choose your own adventure interaction, and we're curious to see what xAPI data, if any, will get out of that kind of out of the box, and then once we figure that out, to try to leverage it to see what we can get beyond that. And I know Matt Perkins, who I don't think is on the call now, he's also interested in customizing a player. So I think that maybe is a little bit longer term project, but we can look at. I think they're good complements to these. So if you have any, if you're interested, check out our Slack channel, and I'll get some updates on GitHub this week for you, Jess.
Awesome, thank you, Erin. I think I saw Jim is here for Team HR Open Standards. Did you want to give your update, Jim? All right, yeah, Megan's putting in the chat. You can activate your mic and camera in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. So I see you, Matt is coming in. So Matt, I'm going to just hop into Team Zoom for you to give your update on behalf of Team Zoom. And then Jim, if you want to hop in, feel free to do that.
All right. So we were able to send our statements to the LRS. So we had already kind of gotten some triggers in our app going, but we're trying to get it end to end so we can kind of get a skeleton going and then start adding on from there. So we had our meeting yesterday and talked about kind of next steps and some features that we wanted to add. So sort of lofty goals are we want to see if we can get some attentiveness and engagement type metrics from Zoom. They used to have one that was built in that they deprecated at one point earlier this year when they tightened their security, probably after everybody started using Zoom after COVID started. So we're kind of going to see if we can kind of build that up. So if anybody's interested in it, you can jump into the Slack channel and our GitHub repo. We'll change links to the code and all that stuff. So feel free to jump in and let us know if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. So I see Jim is on, so I'll go back into Team HR Open Standards for you, Jim.
Thanks, Jess. So we've got our GitHub repository all set up. Brian and I were just chatting about that a minute ago over Slack. We're working on our use cases this week. That's part of HR's HR Open Standard practice for creating updates or revisions to our standard as we work on use cases extensively. So we are working on those. We're going to put those documents up in the repository for next week, and that's our main focus right now. We'll be back with a different update next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. And I see Judy is on the line for Team Pebble, and Team Pebble is here. Go ahead, Judy.
Yes. So we met this week and we've made some progress on our storyboard. We decided to use our team call to sort of look at the storyboard and see how that translated into actual development. And we decided to record it. And I think that's on our GitHub. If anybody wants to see what the development process looks like for the Pebble plugin for InDesign right now. And we just sort of had the conversation of like, okay, here are the things we're trying to achieve and how does that actually translate into the tool? In that process, we decided that we needed to progress backwards a little bit and actually go back and revisit our use cases. So we're going to be doing that and hopefully making some more forward progress on the storyboard this week.
Awesome. Thank you, Judy. And then the last team that I have up in GitHub is Storyline Engagement. And I think I saw Madeline here to give that update. Go ahead, Madeline.
So Jess, I don't think you can get Madeline activated or stuff yet.
Okay, so what we have, there you are, Madeline.
Oh, you guys couldn't hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly fine.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so we are currently, we will be wearing for the watershed accounts, and then start building the storyline content and then explore the xAPI. So yeah, that's where we are at. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And then Brian, did you have an update for Team Makey Makey? I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Brian, if you did have an update for Team Makey Makey, you can go ahead and give that. I see you. There you are. You're here. We can see you and hear you.
Oh, okay. Which camera? There we go. This is always a challenge. Which camera are we on? Team Makey Makey is planning a meeting for Friday at 11:30 Eastern Standard. At this point, we're just going to do a sort of a recap of where we're at. We want to go over the code base, talk about what live code has done for us, and then talk a bit about how we use HTML, CSS, JSON, JavaScript to support the xAPI wrapper, which is a JavaScript library. And that is, although it sounds very complicated, it's really a quick start as to how other teams, if they're struggling to figure out how to send xAPI statements, it's a quick start as to how you may be able to do that just by downloading a library from the ADL website and putting that on either on your computer locally or on a web server. And then you're basically, once you edit a few files and put in specifics about your LRS, you're up and running, being able to send those statements. So that's sort of the plan for tomorrow. And we're just going to catch up with where we've been and talk through what we use to get where we're at.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So if anybody's interested in joining Makey Makey, they have a meeting tomorrow. We're right at the top of the hour, a couple of minutes over. But we'll be here next week at 2 o'clock. So we'll be talking about the learning ecosystem and the role of xAPI and LXP. Don't forget to register for the party. And if you're interested in submitting a proposal, that link is there as well. I'm Jess. We're going to close it out. If you have any questions or needs, feel free to email or Slack me. Now get out there and go make some things. Have a great rest of your week.